Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eleanor Morgan and I'm Head of Programme at MIMA, Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art. And I am a woman in my 30s with long curly auburn hair, white skin and large spectacles and a sort of peachy pink jumper. So I'm here this evening to welcome everybody, and that's a real honour because basically I get to listen in and enjoy the conversation. And this discussion is between Aidan Moesby, who's the curator of this project, and the three amazing artists, Lindsay, Duncanson, Catriona, Gallagher and Sonia, Boué, who will all introduce themselves shortly. But I just have the honour of kind of setting the scene and giving a bit of background to the project. So this conversation, co-hosted with Disability Arts Online tonight, is part of a really incredible project initiated by Aidan as part of his associateship with MIMA, which in turn is part of a larger project, a national project with Dash, MAC in Birmingham and Wysing Arts Centre in Cambridgeshire, which is all about developing the careers and practices of disabled curators. And so Aidan's been working with us since January this year and developing his skills as a curator, working with the collection and commissioning artists. And it's a real genuine honour and pleasure to work week by week with Aidan. He has led this process of pulling together an online exhibition and event as part of that work with us, and has really led a very thoughtful process reflecting on the current situation and artistic responses to that situation and the challenges that that's raised. He has been in conversation with these three incredible artists who he commissioned to develop new works, and also Jade French, who's developed a new essay for the exhibition. And you can see the exhibition that we're all talking about online via MIMA's website, and you can read Jade French's essay on Corridor 8 as well, and see the links through Disability Arts Online too. So Aidan began conversations with these artists as part of a response really to the fact that MIMA closed during the COVID pandemic, and that our work plan basically had to be rethought very quickly. So we started talking about what was important to Aidan, to MIMA, to artists in this moment, and how to grow a new project from conversations, which felt like the things that we weren't able to have so many of in those early days of lockdown. And we settled on the idea that a project growing from conversation that supported Aidan to develop new skills in commissioning work would be a very good way of working with what we had at our disposal at that moment, what we had at our fingertips, rather than waiting for some moment where we might be able to do something different or have something different. So the work that you will have seen in the online exhibition and that will be discussed tonight was made with the context of a website, a digital experience in mind. And I think that's a really interesting way for us to be thinking and working. It was also made with audiences and viewers in mind. And so I hope that we'll have some interesting questions and discussion with you all tonight about your experiences of the work. And really, I think the work that comes out of this challenging situation reflects on so many themes around isolation, around the challenges of not being able to do what we normally do as artists and curators, and really rethinking some of the ways of working and the possibilities of working from home. I think the artists, Sonia, Catriona, Lindsay, have each challenged themselves to do something different and something new with their work. And that process has been very much supported by Aidan as a very reflective, thoughtful curator. And I think the whole project is kind of imbued with this sense of reflecting on a moment. It's incredibly prescient. It's about the now. But I think it also helps us to see some, hopefully some ways of thinking and working and some tools that we might need for the near future as well. So it's just brilliant to have this kind of reflection from these artists and from Aidan and from Jade and partners as part of what has been a very challenging time, and to see new work being developed which for me is one of the most difficult things about this year, has been to create space for thinking and for being creative. So I really applaud all four of you, and I look forward to hearing what you'll discuss. So I'll hand to Aidan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eleanor. So I'm Aidan Moesby, the curator of the project, working at MIMA, as Eleanor's just said. I'm a middle-aged man, particularly pale, with glasses and wearing a white shirt. We're going to go around the artists who are going to introduce themselves, and then we'll get them to talk about their work. So if we can start off with Sonia.
Hi, I'm Sonia Boué. I'm a white, middle-aged Anglo-Spanish female with cropped hair and large black glasses.
Catriona?
Hi, I'm Catriona Gallagher. I'm a white, Irish-British female in my late 20s, and I've got short brown hair. Today I'm wearing brown and blue.
Hello, I'm Lindsay Duncanson. I'm a white middle-aged woman. I'm with cropped brown hair, and I'm wearing glasses as well.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to start off by saying what an absolute privilege it has been to work with the three of you and to see the work that you've produced. I would just like to start off, if we can go back, and if you could just say a little bit about your practice before we get into what it is that you've made during this project. So again, Sonia, if you could just give us an idea about the kind of work that you generally make.
Well, I think I would describe myself as a multi-form artist. I've worked across lots of different forms over the past 7 years, where I've been particularly kind of exploring film for the first time, photography, and sort of assemblage work alongside what was quite a conventional painting practice prior to that. And so I think the thing that's driven me on to explore lots of different areas really is a fascination with objects and the memory that is contained within objects and the kind of atmospheres that can be conveyed by grouping objects together or performing with objects, telling stories about objects, which some of my film work has done. So it's kind of like a multi kind of form approach to storytelling around objects and memory.
Thank you. Lindsay, if we can come to you.
Yes, so I work, I primarily used to work with photography and video, and then I've moved and looking at landscape. I moved into working with body and textile and voice more recently. So I tend to work on large scale photographic prints out, which I make out in landscapes, and then make vocal work that responds to that.
Thanks. Catriona?
Yeah, I make mostly moving image works, and I also write and draw as part of my research into different particular subjects and settings. I'm often working with the collision of the man-made and the natural, trying to understand what those categories are in themselves. I'm thinking about structures and systems, whether that's physical, you know, architectures or layouts in the world around us, or more knowledge-based or kind of cerebral structures.
Could you give us an overview of the work that you've made for Thresholds and talk a little bit about the context and what you're trying to convey with it? Catriona.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. So for Thresholds, I've made a video villanelle, which is called Video Villanelle for Distance. And a villanelle, to begin with, is a poetic form which is, it's got quite a strict structure with an ABA rhyme and 2 repeated refrains. So that's 2 lines that repeat throughout the poem. I decided to use the villanelle as an editing structure to make a new film with. So sort of thinking about the context that we're making these works in, I ended up going through my camera reel of videos and images that are on my phone, stuff that's been on there for a couple of years, and started working through it and trying to kind of categorize, organize the footage. A lot of it's incidental stuff that I've taken when I'm out walking and I see something that's interesting, whether that's in a city or in a rural context. It's definitely, it shows my movements between different places and settings. Over the last few years, I've been back and forwards a lot between the UK and Greece. So that's really reflective in the footage, and trying to kind of, think about how to kind of organize, categorize the shots. So using distinctions like moving shots or still shots, and then using a few bits of footage which repeat as the refrains. So yeah, I just followed the structure for the villanelle to edit with, and yeah, that was the result.
Okay, thank you. Sonia, you've done a new series of photographic works. Could you just give us an introduction to them, please?
Yes, so the commission from you, Aidan, kind of landed at a moment where I'd been really exploring photography kind of quite obsessively during lockdown at home, because I'd been isolated from my studio and not able to go in, and commission sort of coincided with having the opportunity to go back to the studio, but actually moving to a studio which had a lockable door. So I chose to actually move out of a studio space that I'd had for 9 years, which was quite a big decision to make, but it was kind of this context of lockdown easing and suddenly realizing that I needed to be in a studio space that didn't have walkthroughs for other artists. And I kind of swapped a very charismatic open space for a rectangle that was kind of, it felt very private in contrast, very secure, and it also had a window, which I suddenly realized that my other studio hadn't had. My other studio had a skylight. So in one way, I was kind of closing myself off and protecting myself, and in another way, I was giving myself, kind of a way of connecting with the outside world. And I was quite intrigued by that, and I sort of realized that this was quite a moment, and it would be great to capture it with the project. What I hadn't expected was it to become sort of a kind of documentation of the move, which it kind of both is, but not in a literal sense. So it is and it isn't. It's a lot of other things as well. But I think the underlying sort of the very first conversations that we were having, Aidan, I realized that I would need to look at this sort of feeling I had about nostalgia and wanting to sort of regress into safe spaces at the point that I was being asked to kind of move back out into the world in an environment that didn't feel that safe or secure or known. So it was sort of like this contrast between, needing a sense of like keep a bubble around myself while I sort of went out and explored what it was like to work in a studio space again. And then all sorts of things happened, like the door turned out to be not so lockable, and other kind of narratives suggested themselves as we progressed with the work. But I kind of decided on photography because for me, film tends to be a longer process than we had time for. So it's quite important to say this was quite a time-limited, tight project. And for me, there was something about the idea of photography and stillness in this moment of sort of excitement and turmoil that felt quite attractive. And yeah.
Yeah, I think it needs to be said that you've all turned around this work in record time. Yeah, and now it seems an almost unfeasibly short amount of time for the for the work that you've produced. Yeah, finally, Lindsay, it's in contrast of your generally working in those huge landscapes, you've produced something that is very different to what I would say was your usual work. And yeah.
So traditionally, most of the work I make, I go out into landscape and work in those spaces, whether bringing things out or projection or objects into the landscape and document them there. That wasn't something that I could do, and I looked a little bit like Catriona at the archive of imagery that I had and videos that you shoot as you go around, and when and they're in the video sort of water and clouds and reflections and just things that you see as you're walking around, and I've not used in my work, and hadn't really made any work during lockdown or been very creative at all. So it was kind of, the work became about kind of reflecting on these two things, this kind of landscape imagery and the landscape that I wasn't visiting and wasn't going to, but also this kind of sort of static time. I work a lot with my family as well, so they feature in the video, and we travel a lot to make work together and collaborate, all three of us. So I kind of had to ask them also to participate in this, because we were all in this tiny little flat in the centre of Newcastle, but with none of us really able to work in the way that we would normally work. So trying to, and even though we're in quite a tight space, trying to reflect this sort of internal dialogues that you have, so it was really challenging actually to make. It was very challenging to kind of make the work in that space, because we really don't work in our own space normally. We normally go out and we go to places so we kind of tried to create this very still, if you like, set of images, but actually it was quite disruptive to do. It was quite tricky and disruptive to kind of make the work, but I think it worked, and it was really great opportunity to do that, and just to rethink the way that we do work and that I work has been great as well. So.
And can you say something? So you were working obviously within your living room, but then also you've done projections. Can you say something about the mechanism and the ideas behind that? So
I've used projection in work before to illuminate spaces. So I used to work in very rural spaces and use projection light to illuminate and or project onto objects, and around schools and different things like that, and kind of like the idea of projecting the landscape back in. And because we talked about thresholds, and obviously that's the title of the project, but these sort of doors and as a sort of like a membrane to the outside, and they become, this sort of safe space. We're all sort of at home, and the kind of going out into the outside world. So I wanted to use those doorways, but because it's a tiny flat, and to get projection, so we constructed a back projection screen that sat across the doors. And then I was explaining to Joe about, so we had tripods out onto the balconies, kind of projecting in onto the door and out on the walkway, and then the one into my son's room, we had like bamboo, so we had to extend the balcony distance. So there was all kinds of weird and wonderful contraptions, and probably some shouting. And kind of like climbing through windows. We had to climb through windows to get to the projector. It was kind of a juggle, but it worked in the end. So,
yeah, it definitely worked.
Yeah. So,
did you face any particular challenges, Sonia? And Lindsay's already been talking about like what's safe and the inner and the outer and the threshold. So do you have any comments about that and about how you've worked?
I think the challenge for me really was honing in on the narrative. strand, and finding that my thoughts were going in so many different directions. It's not uncommon for this to happen to me, but it was so stimulating having the conversations. And what actually, I was talking about thresholds. So you kind of came into the studio with me a lot, Aidan, and you'd kind of be with me on shoots, and I would be, thinking about the conversation that we'd had prior to a shoot, and then I'd be really keen to share my images with you. So it was a bit like having a collaborator with me in sort of the way that you've decided to structure this project. I think it's really interesting the way it's been structured around conversation. And so maybe the threshold, it was sort of moving from one studio to another. It was swapping a skylight for a window that looked out onto houses where I could see people, I could see the rest of the industrial unit, and sort of garage below, which features a bit in one of the photographs. And yeah, it's like the boundaries of who we are, going into this post-COVID landscape, and how do we move forward and make work? And this project really is about thinking about it in a new way, doing something in a different way. And I think having your voice in the studio space with me was kind of part of that, the whole landscape of the photographs. You're in there in the texture of the photographs, whether you know it or not. I think there's an imprint within them that is about those conversations. And I think it was interesting because the challenge in a way really was to sort of decide when to close the conversation down and to go back into my own space and think, well, no, this is what the narrative is, because we talked about so many, different possibilities. And we had so little time, as I keep banging on about. And I think it might be really interesting for people listening to know it was actually about 3 weeks of actual creative time that we had to make our work, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it.
It wasn't very long.
So I think for me it was a very intense period, a very exciting period. I think I made about more than 1,000 images.
Wow.
And that is, and I'd sort of not done film to give myself an easier time, but actually thinking about it, the amount of time I spent shooting and editing was really intensive and really significant amount of time. So yeah, sorry, I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, it's quite surprising to hear that I was in the studio with you.
Oh, you were.
I part of my aesthetic of both as curator and an artist is very conversational. So, and bearing in mind what you've just said, I wonder how you experience those conversations, Catriona, and then also if you could just say something about like your process or whatever the particular challenges to working within an extremely short time frame were.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, Sonia, as well. I had the same kind of thing of, at what point do the conversations have to stop, and you have to kind of say, okay, we have to put some, because the conversations opened up so many different ideas for me. And, when we first were thinking about, my experiences of lockdown, I was looking at writing and journals, and then that all completely went by the wayside. That was in our early conversations, Aidan. And then I was thinking, obviously, because, being, as you're an artist, not just a curator, it's, there's a lot of your kind of, like, I noticed that whenever the weather was really prominent in the work, you would be like, oh, I really like that shot. Or, these kind of, like, having someone while you're trying it, because for me it was just editing because the footage was pre-existing, and that helped limit what, the amount of stuff I had to do. Obviously the editing structure was really helpful, but it was also so complicated to figure it out that the actual how to make the structure took a long time to pin down before then I could then just bang out the edit.
How was the like the difference between, so you took a very poetic structured form which is generally written down and you transferred it, or translated it into a very visual form. I was wondering if you could just say something about that and that process.
Yeah, it's quite, I suppose, a relief in a way, not to work with words whenever I get the opportunity to, because I get so bogged down, and I like thinking in words. It's the way sometimes my brain works in words before it works in images, but often it's alongside, but sometimes the words come first. So it's really easy for me to work with words, and just doing things visually was really great, because you know, you have to kind of trust that these images are saying things and they're expressing things, or you're having to try and forget what your attachment to, because yeah, that's the thing, is I have a great attachment to all of this footage, and that's the thresholds for me, is that, you know, this is my world, this is, you know, my personal stuff on my phone. Was never intended to be displayed publicly. So that was a threshold to navigate, how much you can give away and how much you have to hold back. I don't think I really held back that much in terms of like editing out shots that just I didn't feel were appropriate. But yeah, I mean, using just the images, I mean, I feel like it leaves so much more open space for what they can mean, rather than the words would fix something down quite heavily for me. Or that's something that I'm always trying to avoid doing when I'm making films with a writing element, which my films nearly always have. That the words, I can trap myself in words quite easily. I have a real love-hate relationship with writing. I say that it's not exactly love-hate, but it's always a struggle. There's always like a tussle of kind of, you know, a power struggle maybe. Love-hate is a bit strong. I'll take that back.
Yeah, you touched upon so that the images that you used were never intended for public consumption. They were intimate images meant for you, your friends, and so I'm just curious about everybody's work. I find there's a real emotional intensity in the three of your works, and very different, three very different works, but so emotionally rich. And I'm just wondering, if we can start with you, Catriona, and then go on to Sonia, about how you approach like that giving of yourself and holding back, and and then where's that threshold of kind of keeping and revealing, but also, and did you intend to share so much emotionally in the works that you've produced? I know that's a very long question. I could break it down, but
well, remind me if I forget one part of it. But I guess I'll start by saying, yeah, actually, because of the first conversations we started having, and you picked up on the emotional elements in my previous works, and I think that brought it out way more in this work than I've ever worked with before. It kind of, because of those early conversations, it gave me more of a permission to really hone in on that, to make a kind of emotional response to this period of lockdown, and for me, for the last 2 years in general, which is the footage that I've used. Remind me of the second part of your question, Aidan.
It's just about making that decision of like how much to give and reveal, and that what's behind those decisions, and did you reveal more than you had intended?
Yeah, I suppose I did reveal more than I maybe would have intended in the past, but it was very intentional with this piece of work, to kind of mine the personal, and for me the threshold is also to do with distance. That's why the title of mine, it's a video villanelle in brackets for distance. Distance is the thing that is, and I'm exploring distance in several different ways in the work, both physical distance, but also emotional distance, temporal distance from an event, from when something has happened. So looking back over, you know, kind of this personal archive of incidental footage with some distance from it. So the events having been a year or 2 or 6 months ago was helpful in terms of navigating that threshold and how much I can give away. Maybe, yeah, I think distance is always really essential for me. And the last couple of years anyway have been about me trying to figure out how far I need to pull back, or how much to, you know, come forward or pull away a little bit, trying to develop my own new thresholds for, you know, for distance and the emotional element of the work. So it's something that's been on my mind for, as I say, a couple of years anyway. So being able to bring it out in this work was, for me, it worked. I feel like I navigated that threshold in a healthy way, for me personally, but also I hope it's an interesting. It's really hard to imagine how a viewer will react to the work, because it is personal, and for me every image is full of all the associations, the events that were going on. But when you strip that out, then what's left, I hope there's quite a lot of guiding. You get the feeling, I hope, of a guiding kind of emotional trajectory.
Yeah, there's no element of like self-indulgence in it.
Thanks. I hope so.
Within
I hope that. Yeah. I can't make that call. So,
Sonia, I mean, you're working with images, totally different format in a way, and yet, you know, within that stillness, you've given away, and you know, every single object is packed with redolence, and you know, you've been, yeah. So yeah, how did you approach that kind of sharing?
Yeah, I'm still turning out my pockets, aren't I? That's what you say. I love that phrase about Catriona's work, actually, in Jade's essay. I think I don't know how to do anything else. I think I work with the interior, I work with the emotional, and I work with the personal. But that's what interests me, and I'm very used to sharing, because, you know, I find that a lot of my work, particularly under lockdown, has been shared online in a very immediate form, in Instagram mainly, and sometimes on Twitter. And for me, it's kind of it's a dialogue. It's conversational, which I think is why I've really gelled with working with you, Aidan. And I've been working for a long time with a family history, which this touches on as well. I can't help but touch on that, because my work's deeply autobiographical quite often. And I think there's something about photography which helps, because it's such a, as I keep saying, it's such a still form, but yet there's a vastness in it. And I don't know if it's because I've got used now to seeing photographs on a really big screen. I work on quite a large screen iMac, and I think there's something about being able to take photographs with a camera that uploads them instantly onto a screen that you can then work with. You know, you can manipulate them. Some of the photographs were a gift and they just came and didn't need any editing, but a lot of these photographs have been worked on. So I guess it's a bit of editing going on. There's honesty, there's authenticity, but there is a process. And I think it's that process that gives enough distance, hopefully, for it not to be an overshare. And there's also, for me, a very important aesthetic element. So I think that is also something that interrupts the gush of the emotional flow, that you're actually working to create something, well, I'm working to create something that is harmonic and balanced, and, you know, creates and conjures atmosphere. So there's something quite intentional, as well as it coming from, you know, I'm wanting to work from an authentic place. There's a core rationale for what I'm doing, but there is also kind of a curation of the work, I guess. So yeah, which helps.
Thanks. And finally, Lindsay, I mean, you working with the moving image, but have produced something that is really quite exceptionally still and contemplative in that.
It's funny that because I was referring to the guys in the video, but we've taken the viewer right into our private space. Like we've normally it's all out and performative, I suppose, and you're out in landscape and you make the works, and a lot of work has a sort of performative quality, especially photography and video, and getting people to do things and setting up spaces, and but sort of crossing in back into your domestic space and making work and working that space has been really interesting to navigate and think about, because even then, it's sort of, I don't know, what is it, but yeah, it's been challenging but also really interesting. And it was interesting to work with, and I was listening to everyone your conversations with Aidan. What was really fascinating for me was actually from the conversations it became very clear how it could be I don't know how that worked, it must be the way but it became very clear how it would work back into the space, because I had, and really probably the most creative things have been the conversations, that's probably in terms of making, that have happened during lockdown. So then it kind of making the work became quite clear, so it became almost like a technical exercise, and then now the work's made, it's sort of reflecting back on it, so I got quite a clear internal vision about how it would work to make the work, and then you kind of have to trust it and then do it because of the short amount of time, and then kind of spending time reflecting on that work and what it means to make a work in that space is sort of, yeah, I'm not sure if that's answered the questions exactly, but it's just a very different way, and I'm very interested in how anyway in that space between working outside and coming into a space, the sort of transition between the two things. So yeah, and also just the idea of the domestic and the landscape and how those two things merge together and what they do to each other. So that's been really exciting to see, and then now I've got time to spend with that imagery and kind of think about how it's sort of post-reflective, rather than kind of really kind of there's something about that collision of two things together that I can now think about and work with in my head. So
there was such a clear like bringing the outside in, and I noticed that even like the books that you picked up from your bookcase were like bird books, and
bird book. Yeah, there were other books there. Yeah, but it was very like and it's because they're the things that you kind of miss, or the wind and like the air, really. And I think that we and even the voice, so we didn't make any, we really made very little vocal work. That's a lot of my practice is that, and there's been, and not even in the soundtrack, there's no voice within that, and didn't choose to make a piece with the family either, because it just didn't, because I think we were kind of voiceless as well, which is and that really is such a huge part of my practice. So whilst there's a clear route to the way the work was made, that there's a lot absent from it as well, I think, which is yes, I think still reflecting on it, and what's made and why. I think
you've all made it, or you've all responded to like the situation, and in a way that I haven't seen out there in the world, that it's not a generic response to, oh, this is lockdown, this is post-lockdown. I think the way that you've approached it, it has, and even beyond this time, I think it'll still, maintain a relevance. And I was just thinking, if you could, so this is just an open question. The work was made specifically for a digital environment, because at the time we didn't know when anything would be open again. And I was wondering about how making something for a digital environment or a digital platform kind of, if that altered or affected how or what you made and how you envisaged the final thing, and that you're working with, you know, there's a materiality in the digital, but there's not necessarily a physicality. So I was just wondering if there's any comments you have about that.
If you guys don't mind, I might jump in. This is the great thing about this work being for a purely digital interface, as you said, Aidan, was it made me feel I could use this phone footage. That's where the idea kind of came from, because it has, you know, its portrait format, and I quite like the idea that someone could even be watching the film on their device, on their phone or on a tablet perhaps. I'm sure a lot of people will be watching on a desktop as well, but yeah, it really defined it for me. So yeah. I wanted to ask actually, Lindsay, because yours is these portrait, I noticed there was, you know, your 3 portrait videos as well. I was wondering about the portrait format in yours.
Yeah, no, they aren't shot on a phone, but they had phone in mind and portrait in mind. That there's something about that, because that's I couldn't shoot it on that film on that type of format because it didn't quite work with the light quality. But they originally were shot on a phone, so I'd shot them originally using a phone to frame them up and to kind of think about it, because that's really been the primary device that we've all had hold of and been using. So it felt really, and I work with some youth groups and they often shoot that way. I quite like it, and I quite like that format. And so it was, yeah, it was good to use it, and it felt right for this period of time as well, definitely. So yeah, I was like, you've done it. So it's quite nice to see yours was that way around as well. Yeah, so I had, in that sense, thinking about the medium, and then also the medium that people have been using has been important. Just that kind of little nod to the camera or the phone, the smartphone and devices that people have, just connecting them with family and stuff. I think that's really important.
Sonia, do you have anything to?
I'm not sure. I noticed the similarities between your films, actually, and it did strike me, and I wanted to ask, because I suddenly had this feeling as well of confinement, because if you look at it on a desktop screen, until you make it bigger, you can really see that shape. Yeah, can't you? And it looked like a narrow corridor until I was watching your films, and until I suddenly twigged, oh, I've got to make it bigger. It was and it looked like, you know, this sort of confinement of lockdown as well, if it's not too much of a cheesy thing to say. And I just wondered about that, particularly yours, Lindsay, because you're sort of in that middle space and you're squished between you know, these 2 other figures, and it's the way you're all kind of not really relating to each other. Yeah,
I think the framing is really important, that tight framing, and it kind of helps to kind of create that kind of claustrophobia of space, and also just to differentiate between within that we're sort of trying to create our own spaces within that as well. But yeah, I think it's interesting it's been good to be able to try that out, really.
And for Catriona's, I kept being struck by the knees as well, which kept recurring, and that, I mean, there's some beautiful footage in there, and, you know, lots of landscape, and then some people, and, you know, cooking, and all kinds of things blended in, which felt really, you know, it was really fascinating and interesting, and sort of suddenly realizing that you're actually seeing some repeats, and the things that kept making me realize that I was seeing a repeat with the knees. And I just wondered whether that they had any kind of sort of particular resonance. Or...
Yeah, I used 2 shots before the repeated sections, which were both sets of birds kind of flying over a beach in Greece, because I also forgot to mention it goes back and forth between Greece and the UK, Greece and the UK, backwards and forwards. So the knees shot is, you know, right before the beach with all the birds flying over. So, you know, being sat in shorts with bare legs, with a slight tan is you know, it's not an image of the UK for me. It's definitely located in Greece. And then the other one, which signaled the refrain for the UK section, was their hand grasping the leaf, which is not particularly, you know, specific to the UK at all, but it you know, it was also a moment of me looking at myself. I don't think it happens that much more in the footage. So and they're both very distinctive shots, so they really help you realize, okay, I'm watching the same sequence again. They're kind of triggers. I picked that up quite early, having shown Aidan the an initial edit, and working with a musician as well, Mark Rigglesford. He picked up on the knees again and again, the knees and then the hand. And so yeah, those kind of conversations helped lock it down as well. Sorry, that was an unintentional pun.
I have one final question that I wanted to ask, and that so I've tried to make this process as accessible and inclusive as possible, and both during the process and in the final exhibition that has been produced. So we've ended up making 3 different versions of the films, for instance, and then making sure that all text is in the or in the images. I was just wondering, has this impacted at all on your on your artistic aesthetic, or how's the process of working as inclusively as possible been? Because I think having like an audio description on your film might not be how you envisaged it. I'm just wondering how has that had an impact, and if so, what?
I was so wonderfully happily surprised with the audio description, because taking a poem form into pure images, then to have audio description, it turns back into a poem again.
Very meta.
Yeah, it was such an enjoyable experience to read it and think about these translations between visual and spoken language, which is, you know, I think about spoken language all the time anyway. So yeah, it was a wonderful, it happened obviously after the work was finished, so it didn't impact on its making, but it's definitely made me reflect on it very differently in a very satisfying way. Also that it can be, you know, I feel like a lot of the kind of the emotion comes through in the words in a really effective way. So I feel like it's a really nice viewing of the work, or rather hearing of the work, for those who need it.
Yeah, no, I actually, it's really, I hadn't thought about it before, because it's so visual and you know, sort of vision and sound, and actually to think about having audio description, I actually think ongoing is just something that feels like it's such a new thought to add it into the video, that I've not had anyone ever ask to do that or suggest that it's done. I know people that do it for theatre, but I haven't, but never for video. So actually, in terms of making my work more accessible and thinking about that, and thinking that that's something that I could offer in work, I think is definitely a positive to take forward, and just thinking more widely about who might want to access work and how to make it accessible so people could, should they want to. It's been an important, just like things to learn really, and good thing to think about ongoing.
Sonia, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just how wonderful it is to have the visual image translated into words as well. Like Catriona says, you know, I was a bit nervous about this talk, because I thought I'm going to be asked to explain my work, and it feels wordless. You know, the images to me feel sort of vast and expansive and beyond words. And I think one of you guys was saying that you felt wordless in response sometimes to the pandemic and to this experience of lockdown and coming out of lockdown. And so to actually have the gift of being given the words for what you've made feels incredible, and for that to be accessible for other people is wonderful. You know, it's kind of like I think we're moving between different kinds of language expression modalities constantly, and perhaps sometimes not knowing what is accessible and what isn't. So to have that actually pointed out to you and done for you is wonderful, and it would make me think about trying to do it for images in the future, because obviously it's vital.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anybody have any closing comments that they'd like to make? So I'd like to thank Sonia Boué, Lindsay Duncanson and Catriona Gallagher for taking part in the conversation. If you've got any comments or questions, please get them into the Facebook or YouTube channel, comments and questions. Thank you. Well, thank you to the artists for a fascinating insight into their work and process. So we're joined live by the artists, and also we have Helen, who is sign interpreting for us tonight, and we're joined by Jade French. And if you could just introduce yourself, Jade. Jade has been working as a writer on the project, and unfortunately couldn't make the recording. So Jade, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name's Jade. So I produced the writing for the exhibition. I'm a museum professional, and alongside that I'm also a visiting research fellow at the University of Leeds. I'm a white woman in my early 30s. I've got medium length light brown hair.
So you've just had a chance, Jade, to listen to the artists talk about their work and their process, and you were commissioned to write a text on their work. So I was wondering if you could just give us a brief reflection on like some of the things that you've just taken away from what you've just heard.
Yeah, it was really, really interesting watching the panel and everyone kind of discuss the artwork again. It made me chuckle that everyone talked about how fast the exhibition was. And it definitely was the Fast and the Furious, this exhibition. Hats off to all the artists and to Aidan and MIMA and everyone involved, because I think they turned around this project in quite challenging circumstances in terms of the lockdown and what was going on in people's lives, and did something really interesting with it. So kind of after watching the video, I think the first thing that really struck me about this project was obviously we're all physically distanced, so we've never met in person. I've never worked with any of these people before, and at the same time, whilst being physically very distant, it was incredibly personal and relational. So that I found a very interesting kind of mix. So that was the first thing that struck me about the project, and I think that's largely down to how this exhibition was very much framed around these curatorial conversations. So I should say that the artists and Aidan were already working together, and then I came on board a couple of weeks into the project. So people had already kind of gotten going. And as I was talking to the artists about their work and beginning to write my text, it became really clear that actually the conversations they were having with Aidan were really, really central to how they were working. So I found that super interesting. And the second thing that really interested me about Thresholds was So in my own work and my own research, I'm really interested in how curating might be made more inclusive and be more accessible. So I've done a lot of work around how curating physical exhibitions within existing institutions like art galleries how we might make that process more inclusive, particularly to learning disabled people. So I found it really interesting that this approach to curating, how that might be more inclusive and accessible to a wider range of people, and how maybe when we take out of the bag this idea of the physical, what that might release. So those are the two things I think I found that struck me about the project.
Okay, I think as far as the accessibility goes, it was we really, as MIMA and my work as a curatorial associate there with the DASH project to look at the representation of, or improve the representation of disabled curators in institutions. And this is the first like almost fully accessible exhibition. So we've put all text on the images, we've got signer in for the panel tonight, and each of the 3 moving images works have got 3 versions. So we're really striving to do that, and sometimes we just have to walk before we can run. I think also I just need to address the time scale of the project. It was like we really knew that we had to work fleet of foot on this project, and part of going to the artists was saying, can we turn it around in this really short time frame? Because it had to be, we had not reacted instantly to COVID, and we had taken time to think about it, and then we still wanted to make something that was responsive. So that was the reason for such a tight timeline on the whole project. And amazing that everybody came up and we've managed it in that time frame. So that's great, and thank you. I just I'll kick off by just asking, what would each of you have done slightly differently, and what is like a major kind of reflective point on the process? So we can start with you, Catriona.
Hi everyone. And thanks for having us here again. It's great reflecting on the exhibition now, and it's up and everything. In terms of what I would change, I don't think I would really change anything.
What might you have done differently?
Yeah. I don't know if I would have done anything differently, really, other than I think it went well as a process. It was fast. It was quick, but I had quite the structure I was using to edit was it constrained me in the right way, so I could, I wouldn't really do anything differently, I don't think. Sorry, that's not a very good answer.
No, that's absolutely fine. Anybody else want to come in on that? Sonia?
I wonder if this is a theme, because I was thinking the same. I wouldn't have done anything at all differently. So I wonder what that tells us about the process that's taken place. I literally can't think of one thing that I would change, which is quite unusual when you think about it.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think because of the way it was framed up, with the conversations, I think it allowed quite a clear path to make the work. So I think in that sense that I had to trust it. I think I was pleased, obviously really happy with how it turned out, and that's brilliant. But but with that conversation, I felt quite certain about what I was going to make. So it allowed me to work very quickly in the time frame, I think. So that's been really good. I think actually one thing, it's led me back a little bit to that kind of slightly more constructed video work, which I haven't done for a long time. So it's been quite good to revisit this particular way of making. Maybe not in the house, but but definitely it's reopened up a little portal in my head for making, and it's a slightly different way, or back to an older way, maybe.
Do you want to add anything, Jade?
Yeah, I was just having to think, what would I do differently? I think I would have maybe liked to have had a go at doing an easy read version of my essay. So again, if anybody knows my work, I do a lot of easy reads for lots of organisations, and I'm really interested in that format, which does itself have its limitations. But I would have liked to maybe have had a go at seeing how that would have worked as an easy read kind of version as well. So that may be something that not would have done differently, but I think would have added on, yeah.
But that's something that we can, reflect on and move forward as we just strive for 100% accessibility. We have a question from Andrew Martin Sugars to all three of you. Did making the work create any kind of solace for you during the time of the pandemic? Does anyone want to take that one?
Well, I suppose I'm thinking about this piece of work being made. It was made within the pandemic, of course. It's become so ever present now. It's hard to see inside and outside of it, but it was made during mostly August and September, which for me, and I suppose for a lot of people, it felt like this window of opportunity that we had in the summer where things got a bit easier, the restrictions eased. Now we've gone full back into it, again, into restrictions. So it did create a sense of solace in the sense that I was in lockdown itself in March, April, May. I felt very unable to do anything creative, but doing this project at the end of that period as a reflective process, what I thought would be, reflecting on the past tense of COVID and the restrictions, which of course they just continued. That was a really useful place to be in terms of if we'd been in full lockdown. I don't know, like in the restrictions we're in now, whether I would be making the same kind of work. So for me, it was very much located within the easing of restrictions part, and being able to go back to Greece during that period as well for me, which is kind of the theme of my work anyway.
Lindsay?
I sort of agree with a lot of what Catriona says, actually. It was a sort of an easing. I really found it very difficult to make creative work during the kind of the full lockdown, just because of the size of the place that I live. There's no space to go and retreat to. So I'm not sure that making the reflecting on the work maybe is quite interesting to think back and reflecting on the work that I've made, but making of it was still, because we were still quite tied in to this tiny space. So actually making it wasn't like a smooth calm process. So I'm not sure, but I know what you're saying. Like there's a nice to sit with the work now and sit with it and view it has a different feel. It's I can reflect with the work, if you like, but at the time I think it was like I know where I want to get to with the work, but you have to go through the process of making, which isn't always, in this particular kind of making, is not necessarily that reflective. But
So if I could come to you, Sonia, and ask you the same question about solace, but also we've got a question from Colin, who would like to know, how did you come to choose the particular objects that you chose? The rocking horse, the doll, the mirror, the pajamas in the photographs, and how did you make those choices?
Well, they're kind of objects that I've had, a lot of them I've had with me for a long time, or they may have, I may have acquired them because they have a significance. They may be stand-ins for, objects that I've had in the past. Some of those objects have been with me, almost a lifetime, particularly the rocking horse, which is the model of one that my sister had. And she's 3 years older than me, so it kind of precedes me in a way. And it was a case of sort of, as I was unpacking my studio, and transferring it just literally across from one space to another, because they were adjacent spaces. It was just a case of kind of sorting through and being with the objects, and then kind of like feeling from the objects which ones could be included, and then also the process of conversation with Aidan was key to that. The pyjamas were specially made for me, which was a bit of serendipity that happened around the commission, that I came across a maker called Anne Tutt who was able to tailor them for me especially. And they sort of related back to the narrative in the book that I use, and they're quite interconnected really, the objects. So it's a bit of a kind of bit of storytelling that I don't want to close down too much on, but that is kind of there in the sequence, which influence some of the objects. And the Solace question is very tied up in that, because for me, I think what I wanted to focus on was this sort of real desire to go backwards in a way to be able to move forward. So I felt this real pull into nostalgia, and being able to articulate some of that did create quite a lot of, quite a lot of solace, because I think my work really is very often about going into interior spaces, thinking about, drawing on memory and the experience of my ancestors to sort of be able to move forward into the present and the future. So yeah, it's kind of a bit of a garbled response, Aidan, but it's all in there somehow. Yeah. I think we did actually reject some objects together as well, if I recall. So it was a very much a joint process as well. So yeah.
Thanks. And what about you, Jade? Was there any solace in the writing and the reflecting and the viewing of the artist's work?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I've been on furlough since March, which I've actually found really, really hard. So this was, only till we got to summer, and kind of September was I starting to get any work again. So this was kind of like, something to do. And one of the things that kind of writing it and speaking, to all the artists and yourself, Aidan, about COVID, about home, about what everyone was experiencing and why they'd made the work and how you'd made it. It kind of really got me to reflect on some things as well. So in the essay, I write a lot about time and there's distortion of time, which is something that I've kind of was wrapping my head around. It's, on the one hand, time's flown. I don't really know what I've done for months yet, in the same breath, which I think is beautifully captured in Lindsay's video. I wasn't doing anything all day really, just sort of milling around, pottering around the house. So I think writing the essay and seeing that reflect some of those themes reflected in the work was really, really, really great for me, yeah.
Okay, I've got a question here from Eleanor, who says, amazing artist, brilliant discussion. I'm interested in your references as artists, whether fiction, art, film, or other. If we could go back to you, Jade, just as a writer, I was wondering if there's any of those influences that are within your writing as well.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't think of myself as a writer at all. So when you contact me to commission me for writing, and I was like, oh yeah, and then you were like, well, you have just written a book, and I was like, oh yeah, but I don't really perceive myself as a writer. In some ways, it's just kind of a thing that I do, to a tool.
Do you have any kind of fictional or artistic or filmic kind of references or influences?
For the text, I guess I do write in quite a personal tone, and my favorite stuff to read, like I love magazines, I love like gossip columns, and I love those kind of like that kind of tone. I think is that's the kind of like stuff I read. I think because of my job at the uni, I can often read quite heavy academic texts that feel very distanced. And there's this whole idea about maintaining academic distance. And that doesn't really work for me as a writer. I find that really stressful and hard. So often I write with, I think the essay kicks off with kind of talking about the porthole of Zoom and how you can see into each other's lives and homes, and at the same time
in a very human way.
Yes. So yeah.
Okay, Sonia, do you have any like influences that you've brought to the work, or that within your work as a whole, whether you know what you're reading at the minute, or film, or artists?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of influence from some fairly classic Spanish films of the sort of just coming towards the end of the Franco era, because I work a lot with this idea of post-memory and with a very specific history quite often. And I work actually with some film stills sometimes in my painting practice. And so I think that maybe some of that does cross over into some of these images, or perhaps particularly some of the work that I made for this project was a bit more performative, which also was a strand which didn't sort of make it so into the final 12 images, apart from one, which is with the mirror. And I think I'm probably very influenced by the aesthetic of some of these sort of 1972 films which were being made by filmmakers commenting on the Franco era in sort of quite an oblique and poetic way. So I'm thinking of Spirit of the Beehive in particular as a film that's influenced me quite a lot. So yeah, if I had to analyse it, I'd probably say that.
Lindsay?
Oh, I think we talked about, I read a lot of the essay by Duncanson, the glass essay, and in particular when we were talking about thresholds and thinking about those barriers and doorways, I think that really was something that played a lot on my mind when bringing the ideas together. But also I'm a sucker for Spielberg, to be fair, and probably a lot of that in film referencing, and also I don't know if you know the photographer Gregory Crewdson, who's also quite influenced by Spielberg, but just those kind of domestic kind of scenes, those kind of uncanny kind of moments, and those that kind of play out in a lot of that imagery and Spielberg's imagery. But Crewdson uses Spielberg's photographer, I think, to light his work. So there's a parallel there, I think. But just that kind of domestic kind of almost horror kind of, I suppose, lighting maybe in the work. But yeah.
Do you have anything to add, Catriona?
It's the question that I always dread, because there's a list somewhere, but I can't access it right now. You know, there's so much that's kind of influenced. There's so much that I'm reading and watching, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly where each one comes in. I guess I'm thinking a lot about Marguerite Duras's work at the moment with writing and film, and how things translate from one to the other, how you make an account of something and how that changes over time, reaccounting something. I've been reading, Kathy Acker and people like that in terms of thinking about, that's not so much in this work, it's kind of background stuff. We talked about Aki Kaurismäki, Aidan, I remember, and thinking about those kind of the moments where something, you've missed the action, and it's kind of the moment in between, these incidental moments, which for me, the footage, having watched his films, the footage that I was using was like that. They're kind of these in-between sections for bigger kind of moments, things that have happened which were off camera, as it were. I don't know, loads of different things. A friend of mine as well, who's been a big influence in terms of thinking about, kind of the way we're interacting with our phones, social media. She's an artist called Geraldine Snell, who makes very interesting video works and thinks a lot about kind of the way we're interacting with the digital world. And that's shaped my thinking a lot, actually, for this particular video. Yeah.
I've got a general comment here from Cultura Plasmic, but I was just wondering if anyone just throw it open. I love that you've chosen to see thresholds rather than boundaries or borders. The emphasis is so much more on the crossing over. and this seems much more hopeful. Does anybody want to respond to that? So rather than seeing a threshold as a barrier, it's much more as a, yeah, that crossing over, a going through.
Yeah, I don't mind jumping in on that.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
I loved it too, and I think for me, perhaps the threshold that I haven't mentioned yet, but I think it probably comes out in the essay, Jade, is about the imagination and the sort of dream-like spaces as well, and the sort of, you know, this weird sort of mixing up of reality and, you know, feeling like you're in a dream world because everything's changed around you and it's all very difficult to process. But there is also a kind of very open, expansive feeling around that as well, and sort of quite a hopeful thing. And I think there is sort of quite a playful element to some of my images as well, and certainly in my practice, so that although this has been about a sort of weird twilight moment in our history in a way, it's undeniable that we have been opened up to new things and new possibilities and new ways of working, as we have done together on this project. So I love it too. I think Thresholds is a really interesting concept and a way of thinking about you know, the current situation, which is much more kind of hopeful.
Any other responses to the hope of thresholds rather than the barriers? Or
yeah, I was thinking a lot about that too, in terms of architecture and spaces, which I work with a lot, and I think all of us do in our work by the looks of things. But I was thinking about, you know, a threshold being, you know, it's never a barrier as such. It's not like a wall or anything, you know. It's there to be crossed, you know. I was thinking about barriers, borders, something that's really prominent in the work, which is only just starting to make sense in my head now, is this, you know, I'm taking myself between, crossing these borders constantly between the UK, northwest of Europe, and Greece in the southeast of Europe, and thinking about movement and what that means, you know, travel, flight, but also migrations of people, whether that's enforced or voluntary, and the way those kind of limits and barriers are kind of becoming more and more present. And I don't know, now, after a little bit of time having made the work, some of those barriers and thresholds are becoming very obvious to me in this piece of work. And yeah, you know, a border, a barrier, a threshold it's kind of like, you know, my impulse is to cross it. It's like when you see a letterbox or something, and you just want to put something in it, or if you see, I don't know, you know, a barrier at the edge of something, it makes you want to jump over, you know. This kind of like, if someone presents this you know, this kind of like stop or threshold or a marker, then my impulse anyway is to kind of, yeah, try and overcome it.
anybody else?
Yeah, just sort of similar, really. When I kind of started thinking about the project, yeah, threshold, I was personally interpreted as this, yeah, not being able to cross and feeling quite stuck. But then as I was speaking with the artists and kind of having my own conversations with Aidan, sorry, my cat's being a great pain. As I was having my own conversations, that definitely changed for me. I just kind of got my essay up, because I'm sure I wrote in it, like the skin of a body, walls of a building, or in this instance, a computer screen, a threshold comes into contact with what lies on both sides of it, linking two environments through the act of separating them. And that's kind of like, that came to be what threshold meant to me, I guess, by the end of the project. Yeah.
And just, we've got a question from Olivia about the works being in dialogue with each other, but also how you haven't actually met. And just wondering about, you know, it's very much about, like, you know, the time that we have now. And also there's an additional question from what did we learn through work? What did you learn through working so quickly? So I guess that's, so you didn't see the work from each other until we all met on screen one day, and you've never actually, you know, met each other other than through this, and it's been quite a fast process. So I was just wondering, yeah, how has that process been, is what a couple of questions we have. Lindsay?
I thought it was amazing. There was some lovely links between all of the works, and I can only just in the formats and in the pajamas and that was this kind of like quite joyful to see when we kind of got the work, and I know once the work was kind of made, and then Aidan said, oh, there's these little bits between the different works, and you maybe suggested some of the things where you'd seen some of the parallels between the works, so we had these little links and threads, so I had sort of an idea that they might sit in, so it was really lovely to see that, and kind of and then like reading Jade's and yours sort of texts and seeing how, and that sort of weaving it all and knitting it all together as well. So yeah, in terms of working quickly, I think sometimes that just happens and you have to, but I think it stopped some meandering. I think just kind of kept it encapsulated, and you just had to really work to that deadline and do it. But yeah, I liked seeing those parallels. It was lovely to see.
Does anybody else want to come in on that one?
Well, I guess the big links were through, you know, speaking to you, Aidan, because you're the one who kept kind of the conversations between all of us going, although, you know, we weren't necessarily talking about each other's work whilst we were making it early on, although I think we did mention it in our conversations. But, you know, you must be this conduit between the works that's kind of brought those things out, which is a really wonderful way to work. I mean, it's a great way to work with a curator, I think. And I think it helps, of course, you know, you being an artist, and that, you know, you get how it works. It was a really great process, basically.
If I'd have been a better conduit, all the works would have been about the weather.
But, you know, there are kind of some of those things coming through in there.
Yeah.
I don't know. It certainly wasn't mine anyway. But yeah.
Anybody else would you, Jade or Sonia, want to come in?
I find it really exciting, actually, and intriguing, because not quite knowing what, I mean, I knew that you were, so there came a stage where I knew that you were both working on film, and that was all I knew. And there were a couple of times when I was meeting with Aidan in the morning, and he said, I'm going to meet Lindsay this afternoon. So it was kind of like almost connecting, but yeah, connecting through Aidan, and then it just being this wonderful surprise when, you know, you shared your film files, and you know, being really excited by the pajama connection, and then seeing some parallels in your films as well, and just, you know, yeah, and the speed of it, I think in some ways was very useful to the work. There's something very it was very clear, you know, the project was laid out very clearly to us. The parameters were very clear right from the beginning, and I just think there's something very whole and complete about it, and that kind of, for me, is reflected in the fact that this is a PDF format exhibition, and there's a sort of neatness about it, which is very pleasing.
Yeah, so there's a question, and I'll just wrap up on this one about the and I know we touched on it in the recorded version, but that difference between and I think it's a question from Trish, is the difference in the experience of knowing something that you're making something for the physical world as opposed to the digital world. And I guess also this kind of connects with you as well, Jade, because rather than having a physical publication that the essay would normally be, again, that's on screen. So yeah, have either any of you got a comment on that kind of digital physical kind of world, and how that has impacted on how you were like making the work or the fine? Yeah.
I've been thinking about it a lot through lockdown anyway, and feeling at some points, you know, kind of lucky to be working with moving image, which is a media which is quite easy to show online compared to, you know, if I was painting or making sculpture, I think I would be feeling pretty sore right now. So I'm feeling lucky, you know, on one hand to be able to make this kind of media which does present pretty well, you know, digitally. And then on the other hand, feeling obliged to make stuff all the time and having to use this moment because, you know, moving image is having a thing and there's all these online festivals and it's like, you know, there's this pressure to kind of produce. But for this specific piece of work, I guess the knowing that it would be seen on a screen, it just helped kind of the loop I wanted the media to reference the way it would be seen. So, you know, I probably wouldn't have used phone videos otherwise. It seemed like the perfect reason to do so, to use something like that. I had a vague idea for making a video villanelle in the past, but I planned to go ahead and shoot footage in 2 different locations. And then I kind of realized because of this exhibition and it would all be online, I actually have all of this footage already. It just looks a bit crass because it's on my phone. Or does it look crass? Maybe that's not crass. You know, maybe there's a charm in and of itself. And I know we really struggled with the resolution and stuff, Aidan, you know, like the phone images, the stills from them are terrible quality. So, you know, it became a problem for the publication that everything was so grainy in my images, and it's just part of it. And I really like that.
It all came out in the wash.
It did, but it's also part of the work. You know, it's important that, as Sonia said, you know, we knew exactly what it was all laid out for us so clearly, but it all made perfect sense, I think. Yeah, and it did. It worked out pretty well.
Any other comments about that digital? Yeah, Lindsay.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because I think one of my initial thoughts, and which is weird because I knew it was going to be digital, was like maybe because I work so much with fabric as well, to do something tactile, it felt like you could wrap yourself up in, but everyone can't be wrapped up in. And I kind of I put that to the side anyway. But then that kind of loss of tactility. I mean, even within the structure of the video, where everyone's very separate and kept in there, and the disconnection even through video online. I think because you couldn't experience it like you would be in a gallery. So it's just trying to convey some of that disconnection.
Yeah.
You know, if you were in a gallery space, you could maybe even be wrapped up in the video. You could wrap yourself, you know, you could create a space that people could sit within, and you could sit in that space with people. But
there's something there about the disconnection. Sorry to cut in.
No, it's fine.
Coming to an end. So I'm going to have to close things down and thank everybody for. Sorry we didn't get to you on this one, Jade and Sonia. Just remains for me to thank everybody for coming tonight and watching. Thank you to the artists, Catriona, Gallagher, Sonia, Boué, Lindsay Duncanson, and Jade French, and thanks to Helen for signing tonight. Also, to just say that the exhibition is available on the MIMA website. Jade's essay is available on the Corridor 8 website. I'd like to thank Corridor 8 for partnering with us, and also Disability Arts Online for partnering with us, and also for running this live stream tonight. And a massive thank you to Eleanor Morgan, whose like endless patience and unerring support has allowed me to bring this exhibition to fruition, and also thank you to MIMA for hosting the exhibition. So on that note, thank you all for coming, and good night.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.